And hello, welcome to the ASP.NET Community Stand-Up. It is February. What has happened? So we've got a great group today. We're going to be talking about localizing the .NET website. So I'll start with quick introductions. We will do our community links, and then we'll jump in. So I'm John Galloway. I'm a PM on the .NET community team. To my right, we have Damian Edwards.
Hello, everybody.
It's been a bit, Damian.
What's that?
It's been a bit since we've had you on.
Yeah. It's been a couple months.
So cool. All right. Then we got Sebastien Ross.
That's me.
Awesome. Okay. And then down below, we've got two people that work on the .NET website. So Dan.
Hey, everyone. Go ahead.
Go ahead. Sorry.
I'm Dan, and I maintain the .NET website.
You guys are so succinct. And I'm Maira Wenzel. I'm the program manager for the .NET website, and I work with John on the .NET community team.
Awesome. And before jumping into the community links, I just saw this pop up where we have to give a big shout out. This is 12 years at Microsoft for Damian today. So happy to celebrate with you. Hooray.
Yay! I can tell if my badge works still or not because I don't have to go into a building. So I just
who knows? Yep. Yeah. All right.
What happens when you get 12 years?
What happens? The only meaningful thing is I will admit I get extra vacation now. So I've been looking forward to this milestone for quite a while. As someone who came from Australia, where vacation is like 4 weeks is like what you get by standard, and Microsoft it takes 6 years before you get to that, and then 5 weeks at 12. I'm like, oh, extra.
So mine 2 months, and going from France where it's 5 weeks.
Yeah,
that actually makes it even. So you can't quit Microsoft now, right? You have to wait for a few years to use.
I need to at least experience 1 year of having 5 weeks because I don't get it yet. It just starts accruing from this day. So I'm very happy.
I have 1 year of that. I just hit 13 last week.
Nice. Very nice.
Very good. All right. I had forgotten, by the way, I was talking to Maira before, but she was at Microsoft before, and you first started at Microsoft in 2000 and what?
In 6. It was not contiguous. Like it was, I took a break, and so the vacation you still accrue when you come back, and you still count for the year, so that's good. But we moved to Europe in 2013, and so I had to quit Microsoft, and I stayed like 2.5 years. So I started in the ASP.NET Docs team back in 2006.
Very cool. All right, well, let us jump into our community links real quick. So these get shared out all over the place. I don't have a whole bunch of links today, so we'll go through them relatively quickly. You'll see the list down at the bottom of the screen, and I'm going to switch us to this mode. We'll see how that works. All right, so first of all, performance improvements in ASP.NET Core 6. So there are quite a few. This is a really cool post. This follows along kind of the format that Stephen Tobe's been doing, going through and reviewing all the different performance improvements and going specifically into some of the commits. So you can look at them. You can also run this benchmark code on your own, which is pretty cool. And so some of the, kind of cool ones, span of T, it's great to see that just continue to ripple through all of .NET Framework and being turned on here for some string improvements. I feel like they kind of buried some of the really exciting ones. There's further down, there's some really neat stuff about idle connections and some really big number differences here. So for some of these cases, especially with things like pooling and 0-byte reads, some big differences. So for instance, pooled connections now going from like 10,000 connections to only 16 on the profiled machine. And so some really big drops in memory usage. You'll see here going from even 600 in .NET 5 down to 160 in .NET 6. So that's pretty neat. Skipping over just a second, the EF core. Also, we've got Blazor interrupt. So this is really neat, using the native built-in interrupt stuff for byte arrays between Blazor .NET code and JavaScript code. And you'll see it's always fun to delete code. And you'll see here's the example where we've got implementation code, and then here's the .NET 6 code where it's just, send and receive the bytes. So that's a 78% performance improvement there. Big changes for input file, and then just a bunch of hodgepodge. And of course, as always, you'll see Ben Adams' name pop up on a bunch of these, which is really neat. It's always cool to see all those. Going back to Entity Framework here, in case you missed it, they linked out to a previous post here that Shai on the EF team wrote up, and a lot of cool improvements here as well. So this is the EF Core 6.0. So this was going back to Preview 4, but talking through about all the different focus areas that they did on that. They also link out to the Tech Empower benchmarks. In case you haven't looked at these for a while, these are not Microsoft run, these are community run, but you'll see here in 20, you'll see Microsoft at number 12 there, which is pretty cool, especially when you consider the ones above it are pretty specialized. You're writing in Rust or C++ in a lot of these cases. So this is the Fortunes benchmark. A lot of time in the past, you'd see us talking more about like plain text or kind of more specialized benchmarks. And this Fortunes kind of exercises more of a database, like doing a bunch of things, database queries and stuff. So this is pretty cool. So always happy to see that. And then this was actually run back in a year ago. And so you can also poke around in here at these are kind of the continuous runs. And so this is a recent one, and you'll see, it's gone up 1 in this. And also numbers wise, this is at 446,000, and the previous one was what? I don't know, 400,000. So cool to see the improvements just continue to keep rippling through. All right, just a few more here. So Neil Swinberger writing about how to get ASP.NET Core server URLs. So this is the actual kind of like ports if you need to get hold of that. And so, of course, team members feel free to jump in if you've got information on this. But looking here about the one that I saw, the main one that jumped out to me was using the iHosted service, and then also, let me see, there's like a get URLs, and I'm forgetting where that was.
Yeah, this is one of the short list of spaces where in the change to the minimal hosting APIs in 6, how you can get the URLs or when during startup actually changed. And so if you use the generic host in .NET 3 through 5, or the web host, you have access to the URLs by the time, like what was your configure method was called in startup. But in the new minimal host, the web application host, you have to start the host before you can get the URLs. If you try and get them earlier, they'll just be empty because the server hasn't been initialized yet. So it's just a slight change in the startup lifecycle that was caused by the fact that web application kind of condenses the lifecycle down from a number of phases to like 2. So yeah, I hit this myself a couple of weeks ago. I was like, why can't I get the URLs? They're all null all the time. And then I asked Fowler, and he's like, oh, you have to get it after you call start. So small change there.
I think if I heard right on the last, we did a minimal API deep dive, and Safia said that they actually, like, VS Code parses out from the console output in order to get the ports.
Yeah, so like by default, the host echoes the ports out. So when you start an ASP.NET Core app, you'll see it echoed in the console. Yeah, and we're now listening on these URLs. And so, yeah, I know that in development, for a bunch of development tools will rely on that as the way to know that the server has started. So for example, I think .NET Watch uses that, and to know that the server is now listening. because as opposed to trying to coordinate something a lot more complicated between multiple processes.
Yeah. It's cool too. Niels is watching live, and he said he's working on a follow-up to this to show how to start a secure ngrok tunnel. So that'll be cool to see. That's why he's looking for those words. So, well, the only other link I had to share is this one, and this is the official announcement about support for. So this adds on support for Japanese and simplified Chinese, which is super cool. So there's the globalization, which allows a site to be localized, and then there's localization, which is actually implementing it. And so I will share specifically this link over in the chat, and then I will turn over to you folks, and we can talk about how the heck you did this. So, oops, Maira, you're muted.
Of course. And can you share the dotnet homepage today? Because we have something special going on today.
I can. Okay, let's do that.
And
oh my goodness, what's going on over here?
Yeah, so we're starting to celebrate our dotnet 20 years. And like with the localization, we like if you switch on the bottom or if you switch on the locale up there to Japanese or Chinese, you'll see that we were able to sim ship the content. And so there are some strings left, and I can explain how this works. But yeah, we'll go into the details of how it's going. It's kind of like still like I would consider a beta. Like we're still going through some like fixes and like enhancing our side of the pipeline, automating some of the tasks. So like we're still figuring out and making improvements. But yeah, like we shipped the site today, the new homepage for the anniversary, but we managed to ship the 3 languages already. So it's pretty cool.
Very cool.
And so let's go
I just have to say,
my...
I know very little Chinese, but I have to say one of the things I love about the small things I've learned is dates in Chinese are super cool. They're so sane. This means February, so that means month, and this means day, so the 14th day. And you can just like this is the 3rd month, right? So this is March 17. So I just love how organized it is. It's like a programmer designed this language. So that's one of the few things in other languages I've started to learn. And I'll hit dates and I'm like trying to learn these bizarre names and things. And like Chinese dates are just like, nope, they're just right there. So.
Yeah, and so if you see any issues with the translation, please use the feedback button. We take a look at that, and we're always trying to improve and correct things that I don't speak Chinese, so I cannot say if it's wrong or right. When we get to enable other languages, and we do have a question whether we're going to support traditional Chinese. So the plan is to add and roll out new languages on the upcoming months. And so when we get to Brazilian Portuguese, then I can validate the text, but other than that, I can't. So let's go to my slides. And now I will be one monitor, so please interrupt me if there's any questions or any comments. So what is the motivation for this, right? And so we do have huge traffic. So this is our website traffic for the month of December. And as you can see, the breakdown of visits, like China has 13%, United States 12%, and you can see kind of like our top 10 visitors there. And so our front door, which is our dotnet.microsoft.com website, has been English only for a long time. And we've been wanting to enable this localization for a while now. So we finally made it happen, and we started with the process. And so to be able to be more friendly to all these audiences coming to our site, and we started with China, like with simplified Chinese and Japanese as our test, like to test how the reception was going to be and what's the China has, like, it's our top visitor usually, or among the top 3. And so this was a huge motivation for us to go and enable that. So this is kind of like our overall architecture of the site in general. This is kind of an old slide, and added like a little Blazor icon for our live TV component that is in Blazor. So we have 3 environments. We have our production environment that is hosted on front door. We have an auto failover to the staging environment, and then we have a Dapper environment. And inside of each environment, we have several components. So we have the core website, which is where we started the localization process for this. But then we have several components that are still need. So you might visit some parts of the site that will still see English only content. So that's why, like, we have the main repo, and then we have other components like the live TV and the learn content are hosted in different repos. So we're going through the process of getting that globalized and localized as well. And then our process started with a conversation with Damian and Sebastien about what do we choose for our localization project, right? And so we discussed the PO file versus the resource files, not the resx files, and both like guided us to use PO files. And so PO files stands for portable object. And so they are distributed as text files containing the translated strings for a given languages. So, and usually a pair of ID and translation. So for example, this is the source in English, and that's what becomes in Japanese. So that's actually from our website. And so some of the advantages of using PO files that, one, they support pluralization. They aren't compiled, so they specialized tooling and build steps aren't required. So in our case, it was a matter of adding the NuGet reference to Orchard and getting the code, like, to read the resources, the resource files. And it works well with collaborative online editing tools. That part we are not like Sebastien can go over that, but like Crowden and some of those online tools, you can use it if you have like an open source project. You can use some of those collaborative online editing tools to get the translations and get the community support. Because our code is still closed source, is not open source yet, we can use crowding yet. And I thought, like, that's my take as well. I thought it was really easy to read and parse the PO file. Like, finding any issues when we were going through the translation process with our localization team and finding where we had like leftover sentences or things that didn't seem right, even though I couldn't speak the language. Like, we found a bunch of issues just by being able to read that file very easily, and we can show what they look like. And so for the phases of the project, so we have, first we enable globalization. So the first step that Dan did was to make it sure that is like changing the code to be culture, how do you call it, Damian? Culture,
the middle, which part?
The middleware. Yeah, like
culture
the middleware.
Neutral?
Yeah, culture neutral. Thank you. And then the second phase was to add the locales and support for simplified Chinese and Japanese. So adding that. So the globalization change went live maybe like a few months earlier. And then the support for simplified Chinese and Japanese in December. And then the next phase will be to globalize and localize the additional components. And then fourth phase would be to add additional languages. And then the fifth phase that I see is tailoring the content for some locales and then doing pluralization. So right now we are not taking advantage of that PO file support for pluralization, but then we can see where in the code it makes sense to add that. And for tailored content, I mean, for example, in our community page, we do support, we have links to YouTube or things like that. But like for someone in China, for example, they cannot access certain sites. So can we tailor that content and have it something that is personalized for each lookout? So that's kind of the goal of the 5th phase. So I think, yeah, that's the end of it.
We had one quick question about how we're using front door. So, I mean, I would probably incorrectly explain it as like a front end proxy, right? But I mean, like, what are the things it does for us?
It's kind of our CNS. Dan, do you want to take that over?
Yeah, so our front door kind of mitigates risks to our site. Like, let's say, like we get a lot of hackers who try to, who try to shut down the site by using attacks like DDoSing. It mitigates that, and also it handles our failover to our staging site, and also it routes it kind of connects all of our separate components in the different repos and ties it in and kind of funnels that into our main website. Yeah.
Cool.
All right. Sebastien, do you want to show a little bit of how that works, like using PO in ASP.NET Core now?
I will do that. Oh, that's my screen.
It is your screen.
Wow, it's magic. I like it. I didn't expect that. Usually I have to click like share my screen. Nope.
Here, look,
Someone hacked into my computer. So I made a very simple ASP.NET app. It's a Razor Pages web app that will show how to localize using PO files some views. This is a very simplistic one. The .NET website is much bigger. So I'm just touching the simple things. This way, no issues. So here, the idea when you have a web app here in the views is to localize it, is to use services that are part of ASP.NET already. So, sorry. So the first thing we need to do is to inject the localizer. So iView localize, what is that? iView localizer, where is that? Localizer, and wow, that's incomplete. Oh, that's fine. And I usually call it T, like translate. This is something common in most open source systems. And here, the idea with this localizer in ASP.NET is to pass the string you want to localize as in the indexer of this view localizer, okay? And I think that's what you meant, Maira, before when you said culture neutral. I think you meant culture aware. It's like converting all the strings that are just strings into something that will be lazily converted to the local culture, to the current culture. And if I do that, the idea is that this function here, well, this kind of delegate, will just render this string if there is no other available text. Okay, so here it will just be a no-op. To have that, however, we need to enable the view localization. So we can say add view localization. And I think, and there is also app.use request localization. So this thing will add the services for the view localizations and all the localizer infrastructure. And this one will inject a middleware that will select the culture of your app based on either the query string, some cookies, or the browser preferences. What's your default language in the browser? And
so Seb, technically, you could not put the middleware in the first step, right? You could just do the string factoring and then enable the view localization, and then every lookup, you'll always just have the default culture and it'll always not find any matching string. You'll just get the default string back. Is that true?
Yep.
Yep.
So that's actually the steps you should do. But you still need to do that because this one, without that, won't resolve the iView localizer. There will be no service for this interface.
Right.
So if I run that, Somehow I broke my hot reload, so forgive me if I have to restart every time. So it's building, but this is before the change, and this is after the change. Nothing changed. So that's the idea. We can change a string like this to a localized string. And now if we want to use PO files, what we have is the Orchard project, which is, we can think of a CMS, but we have a bunch of framework NuGet packages, has a package that you can inject. And this package, I have it in the CS proj. I will just uncomment that. Orchard core localization core. So it's a NuGet package that provides PO files implementations for the localization providers. So this is, maybe I need to restore. So add portable object localization, which will have services. And then here, this is configuring the services to say that we accept these cultures, okay? English, French, Spanish, and I just need to add another import here. And with that, at that point, I can enable the service that will select the culture based on query string, based on cookies, and browser. So if I run the app again, nothing will change. It will still, so I won't actually go there. It will still return welcome because there is no other property, well, no other string provided for the languages. But what I can do at that point is add a PO file. So I will just add a text file. Oh, it's here. Like I typed, it went away. Next. That I can call, I use French for now because I know this language. Add, I tried with Brazilian Portuguese, but it's too complicated. So FRPO. And here what I can say, like in the slide that Maira shared, is I will pass the ID of the message, which is actually the text we want to translate, and the text to translate it. So bienvenue. Here. Okay, just that thing. And I will run the app again. It will load the file if I didn't make any typo, and make this string available as replacement of welcome. What's happening here is that I'm still in English because that's the language of my browser. But if I hijack the request pipeline by saying culture equals FR, then the page is rendered again. The middleware switched the UI culture, the current UI culture, to French because I typed it there. And then the localizer will try to pick up the string welcome in the French dictionary and will return that. Okay? Now, if I want to create a Spanish file, because I know actually I'll translate bienvenido. Thank you. Oh, you want to do it in Brazilian?
I don't need to.
Then something.
Vindo.
Okay. Let's say it's okay. Sorry, I'm hacking the demo, but that's okay. I hope it works. I'm scared. PR, FR. And there is also culture fallback. Like if you say ES-MX, it will also fall back to yes if it doesn't find a string. So BR will work, FR will work, and anything else will just fall back to English because it's defined as the default languages.
Seb, should we take a moment to explain that culture identifier? You mentioned fallback, but for folks who have never seen this format before, they might not quite understand how that works.
The idea is that you have the language and the region. Like in English, you could have English Canadian, English British, English US, and English, the mother of all Englishes. And when you have a culture, usually is that it's usually your language, the language, and the local, the region. So when the browser sends a query string, a header with the requested languages, it will send it this way. So what will happen is that the PO file, the localization system, will try to find the localization for the specific region that you are using. So in this case, something like en-us, okay? And you can provide strings specifically for ES or strings specifically for Canada, okay? And if the string is not available in this region-specific file, then the localization services will try to request again the same ID, whatever the source is, to the language version, like the EN without the.
I can do the EN-US translation. I speak English simplified.
So how do you say bathroom in English?
No. So welcome, you would just say howdy.
Yeah. I don't know if it will work in this case. Yeah. Let's try that, right? Because let's try that. So if I reopen the site, I didn't add EN-US. Did I add EN-US actually to the programs? Yes. I did add it. But this one was open. Didn't work. Maybe because, I don't know, EN-US. EN-US. Why is it French? Maybe I didn't save the file. Aha.
Oh.
You always need to save the file.
Maybe it was trying to give me some culture.
Dude, it's just falling back to French because it knows that that's the best language, right? So it's like let's everything be in French. I don't know. So it will work eventually. So maybe it's because I did something like that. I don't know. Oh, maybe because you need both of them.
You've set the default culture to EN, which there is no file for.
Yeah. But it should then fall back to.
It won't fall back, I believe, to. It won't fall up. You can't fall up from EN to EN-US, right?
I believe I need to add the mother tongue. So.
Yeah, so that, I mean, it's an interesting point. One of the design principles when we built this new localization abstraction and the behaviors behind it when we built ASP.NET Core originally was to be explicit. So we wanted to move from how old ASP.NET and .NET tended to work, which was magic. Windows knows about culture. Windows ships with all the language on the planet and all the format strings, and you don't have to do anything in your application. We'll just have these magic defaults because culture isn't just used, obviously, for resource localization. It's used for formatting of numbers and currency and dates and things as well. So there's actually two sides to this coin, and today we're really only talking about the localization as it pertains to strings. And so we made a conscious decision to change the fundamental kind of basis of the design, which was, no, you want to be explicit. With ASP.NET of past, what you could end up quite easily getting into the situation of was that you build your website in whatever language and whatever culture you are as the site owner, and you don't put any effort into globalization. But then someone requests your site from a different culture, and .NET automatically, by default, would try and reformat strings in their culture because their browser would have sent a culture identifier, and then ASP.NET would have automatically interpreted that to set the current culture. So now the dates get formatted in a different format. And while that sounds good on the surface, it can actually lead to breakages in terms of how the UX works, because you may never have tested your site in this user's culture, and now numbers are longer. Or
I saw cases with currency. Sometimes it would change the currency specifier, and it's like, that's just wrong.
That's not what I'm trying to tell you it's this price, not this price in UK pounds or whatever it might be. Yeah. And so we made this conscious decision to be explicit. So it does mean that sometimes when you first get it set up, it can feel like you're having to tell the system everything. It's like, why do I have to put all this stuff in? And it's because of reasons like that. We wanted to set it up so that you are forced to specify, yes, I want this culture to be supported for this website that I am building, and you need to be explicit in code. And as you know, Seb just hit, sometimes that can feel unintuitive because it's like, well, I have EN/US as a supported culture. Why didn't it just infer that I support EN? Well, you didn't tell us that you were going to. The culture system will fall back in terms of looking up strings, but it won't fall back in assuming that you've tested your site for a certain culture. So once you get over that kind of hump, I think it becomes a lot more, it becomes a lot easier to kind of understand.
We've got a few questions I wanted to run through real quick. So one is, can you explain how does Orchard fit in here? Because a lot of people think of it as a CMS.
I'm sorry. So Orchard historically, 10 years ago, 12 years ago, was a CMS. Orchard Core, which has been reworked 5 years ago on .NET Core. Orchard Core is a framework to build modular and multi-tenant applications. We happen to also ship a CMS based on this modular and multi-tenant framework. That's the Orchard Core CMS. As part of this CMS implementation and Orchard Core framework, we had to implement stuff that wasn't available in ASP.NET as is. For instance, PO file support, because when a CMS deals with localization for all the views, we needed a way to, open way to be able to edit all the languages and also support pluralization, which was not available in the resx file. So because it was not available, some people in the community made some modules to support PO files, to add PO file support to ASP.NET. It's part of the Orchard project, the umbrella project in the org, but it's available on NuGet to use in any ASP.NET Core app, and it has no dependency at all on anything that is CMS related, modular related, multi-tenant related. It's an independent NuGet package. We have a few like this. So that's how the Orchard Core package, Orchard Core localization package is shipped. It's made by the Orchard community contributors, but it has nothing to do with the rest of the system. And it was a very intentional way to do that because we want any ASP.NET developer to use it. And if you go on the documentation page of localization for ASP.NET Core, which I will open here, so this is the official documentation explaining how localization works. There is a section, portable object localization, that explains how to do these things and what package to reference. Okay, so that's the idea. So I'm kind of sad that it's part of Orchard because people get confused, but just think it's just like any other NuGet package that the ASP.NET team that didn't want to have to implement because it's just open. We could do like database storage, PO file storage, all the formats that you can imagine, but that's the Orchard community needed that, so we did it, and it's just available for anyone to use.
And the way that go ahead.
Go, Maira. No, you're fine.
No, I was just gonna say that the way that we're using, so we have that NuGet package reference on our project, and so where the system finds that iView localizer, where how Sebastien was showing, then it will extract all those strings and generate the English PO file for us. And so that will be sent out to the localization team that has their own process of managing what's new and what's like still there, like that wasn't changed in the process. And so they have a way to do a diff. They have their own tools. So that's internal to Microsoft, but Crowded and everything, other tools like that, if you use for your open source project, you can, they have a way to do that diff automatically for you too. And so then we receive the localization back it's like an LCL file. So it's like an XML file that the localization team generates for us, but then it like the artifacts from our pipeline then will generate and spit out the Japanese and Chinese versions for us. And so that's how it kind of works for our project.
Okay. And so what it's spitting out at the end of that is PO files that are just shipped with the site then, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. Cool. Another question here on, can you do this with services like Bing Translator? And part of what I'm thinking about here and something I've seen over time is we have the benefit of being able to send off to like vendors who can do like professional localization. But for a small site, I have seen people write, systems that will just go and, like automatically do a best effort, first pass translation. Is that possible, or thoughts on that, I guess?
I mean, it's totally possible, right? It all comes down to quality. I think I've heard both arguments. I've heard folks who say they appreciate that if their culture isn't specifically translated into, or their language, that at least there was a fallback where they went and used an automated service. And then I've seen others say the opposite, which is, like I would just prefer you show it in English if you don't have my specific language, and then I will translate it if I want to, because the automatic translation gets too many things wrong, or whatever it might be. And so that may change depending on the nature of the content as well, because some stuff translates automatically better than other stuff, depending on what you're talking about. And so I think that's very much a personal decision in the sense of, for a given project, for a given audience, trade-offs involved, et cetera, whether you do something automated or not, or whether you crowdsource. Like, that's often something that you see for more sort of community-driven projects, is you may have crowdsourced localization. But as you said, John, like, we're fortunate, but also we're a global company, and so it's kind of part of doing business is that localizing is important. And in fact, in some parts of the world, it's regulated. Like, you have to localize. You have to offer, if you transact business or commerce in a particular region, you are mandated by law that you have to do so in a specific language. And so it really just depends on all of those variables about what type of thing that you would ultimately decide. But the big thing here is we wanted to design a system that had choice. .NET traditionally, because it was Windows based, you just basically got Windows localization. And then there was a layer on top of that was .NET specific called the Resource Manager. And the default flow for everything was you create regex files, which was a proprietary format, XML based, really intended to be used from Visual Studio. There were no other tools other than that, really, that shipped in the box. So if you wanted to do the type of thing that Maira said before, where you, as the developer, create the original strings and then you hand off those strings to a professional localization company or contractor or whatever it might be, typically they want different tools. They'd have a different pipeline that they use to manage those resources than what a developer might use. And so I know back 15 years ago, there were custom internal Microsoft tools for managing regex because we used it for our own properties, but they were never productized. They were never made part of the .NET offering or the Visual Studio offering because they were so specialized to the internal team that managed this process. And I can tell you at Microsoft, things like localization and culture specificity are taken incredibly seriously, and there are entire divisions that not only perform that service but set the rules about what we are and aren't allowed to do when something is part of a Microsoft offering or is representing Microsoft somehow. The same way that in Windows, there are geopolitical considerations that need to be taken into account for pretty much any type of feature design. The same applies to .NET, et cetera, et cetera. So making a system that was flexible was super important. And then also, as part of going cross-platform, we needed to revisit some of these Windows-centric defaults in .NET Core, of which there are a few. That can be gotchas. But talking about regex is still the default. So if you just add localization like Seb did before, but you don't add the PO file, a specialization of that, then you'll be using regex. By default, what the system is looking for is an embedded resource, which is created as a result of the default build pipeline that occurs in .NET applications, where it finds .regex files, compiles those into .resources, which live inside the assembly as a binary resource, and then named using that culture string hierarchy that Seb showed before. So you'd have like myresources.en.regex, and that's the English resources with the name myresources, and then that would go into your output assembly as the myresources resource asset for English, for EN, associated with that culture. Now, that would actually end up in what's called a satellite assembly by default when we have culture-specific satellite assemblies. And again, this is all .NET specific, but if you've been working in .NET for a long time, that might be what you're familiar with. And this idea of having text files might seem really, bizarre, or putting them in a database. I know a lot of folks like to put their strings in a database so they can have specialist tools that they sit on top of that, so you can edit the strings and you can do bulk operations and stuff really easily because you build a custom app for it, or just use SQL to manage it. So all of those things are possible, but the ASP.NET team maintains the resx/resource manager implementation. The PO file implementation that Seb showed you is maintained by the Orchard team, or the Orchard community, I should say. And then there are likely other formats, either custom for a specific project or other industry-wide formats like XLIF, I think is another one that's common. And there's been talk of us supporting PO file is a text-based format, as Seb said, but you can compile PO into MO files, which are a binary format. And indeed, if you're on platforms that support getText, which is like an old Unixy/C level localization API, you'll generally compile your PO files to MO files, and then getText will look up the resources out of that. We don't support the MO file format yet in this PO file implementation, but it's been suggested that maybe we should. Especially now that, with things like Maui coming on board, which is even more multi-platform than .NET Core/.NET 5 is, then support for that format might actually be advantageous. But as I think Maira mentioned in her slides, that would require build tools. PO files don't require any special build tools; they're just text files. But an MO file you would need to create from a PO file, which means that when you run .NET Build, something has to compile your PO files to MO files. So we would need to do that work. So there's been some very early discussions about that. But like anything, we kind of need the feedback. We kind of need people to tell us what do they think is missing when it comes to localization in .NET today. And we'll be very open and say that the localization abstractions that we're looking at now were built as part of .NET Core 1.0 when the only workload was ASP.NET. Like, we really designed these around those scenarios. They were, obviously the base abstraction is designed to be very loosely coupled to anything. But as .NET moves into more application types and thus gets more requirements, we kind of need that feedback from folks to help guide, should we invest in a different implementation that's going to better serve where .NET is going.
And we had some questions on the chat about if Blazor supports that, if Web API supports that, and that's kind of like our next step, because we do have a Blazor component and we do have Web API. So can we use the same technology for that too?
Yeah, so Blazor supports iString localizer. There's documentation on how to do that. The iView localizer that you saw Seb use, that's an ASP.NET Core, so it's actually an MVC specific layer on top of iString localizer. So the iView localizer does two things on top of what a standard string localizer does. One, it understands HTML and the problem with encoding HTML. And so when you use the default implementation of iView localizer, it will, it endeavors to do the right thing when it comes to encoding HTML correctly. The second thing it does is change how the automatic lookup in terms of the resource name is resolved. And so the iView localizer basically has an opinion on how to take the current view where the iView localizer is being used and find the matching resource. And so if my view is index.cshtml, it's going to assume there's going to be a resource called index somewhere under pages or under views or whatever the hierarchy is. And there are options to tweak those lookup paths and how it finds those. But if you don't want that lookup behavior, you're probably better off just using iString local. I think there's actually an iHTML localizer which sits in between them as well. And so there's a couple of different sort of behaviors that you get when you get any given iString localizer implementation. And one of them is, well, where do I find this string that you asked for? It's like, it's not magic, right? Like the iString localizer of T is commonly used, and the T is just a type, and then we just toString the type name and say, well, okay, we'll use that type's name as the location that we're going to find the resource in. And so if that was, you have to go all the way back to, if you're using a resx file, that generally means you have a resx file titled after the type. So you might have like my customer repository.cs or something, you would have a my customer repository.resx file. And if it's a PO file, I'm assuming the PO file looks it up. The PO file implementation looks up things similarly. It looks for file names that match the whatever resource name it is that you're trying to look up. And again, that can all be customized. Like you don't have to rely on what's there, but that's also we've noticed that's a bit of a bump that existing .NET folks experience when they move from how resx files typically work in older .NET applications, where the tooling generates you a static class with a bunch of static members and there's really only one class per resource file, etc., to a system that's a lot more flexible, where you just create as many resx files that you like, but there's a default behavior where it expects to find those effectively find the resx files in a certain location depending on where you use the string localizer or the view localizer. It's all documented, so I encourage folks to go and read the docs and play around with it for 15, 30 minutes or whatever to get themselves familiar with how it works, and then know that you can customize it if you need it to look somewhere else.
Do we have, I seem to remember a long time ago, we had some like sample projects where you could actually bring up and run those, I think in the GitHub repo
so
somewhere.
So on my GitHub repo, there is an old one I did ages ago, which was like file new, but globalized. So like I just took all the strings. I did that process where all the strings get moved in. I think we have an MVP who maintains a version of the templates as a package that are pre-globalized. And so that you don't have to do the string localizer setup and passing all the literal strings from the template in. What we don't have today that I'm aware of is a tool that will automatically like look at all your CS/HTML files and globalize them for you. That we talked about doing that way back when, but we've just never got it prioritized. I'd love to see it occur so that you could just point it at any ASP.NET Core project or whatever, a bunch of files, and it would do that work for you. It'd say, oh, here's a string literal that is not passed through a string localizer or a view localizer. Let me update the file for you. Because that's, as Maira said, that's usually step one after you've decided what format you're going to use, is that you need to go and update every single file that uses a string. That would be a really useful piece of tooling to have. I know in the PO file community, that is something that you do find for other platforms. They do have those type of tools that will take an HTML file and update it so that it runs it through a PO interface. So.
I know Dan wanted to show some work. I don't know if we still have a few minutes for that.
We still have we can go like 20 more minutes as long as people can stay on. I did want to take one more question, partly because Sebastien was interested in it. So do we deal with pluralization, or is it just like a strict string match, or how does pluralization play in here?
I want to show you, but Dan, I don't want to take too much of your time.
No, go ahead.
I think we want to be useful as well. I think like you're showing a simplified view of what happened on our site. So it's like,
okay. So, and I don't think you use pluralization so far. So
no, yeah.
Okay, next. Now you will see that you can use that. So
Exactly.
I did a quick change while Damian was talking, which is add this line of code. I could have bound it to some model, but I'm too shy. So here, pass the count query string to the count variable. And the idea is that what if I want to translate there is count item? The issue with pluralization is that count can be 0, 1, 2, 1 million, 100. And in English, there are 2 plural forms. So based on the value of count, I would write there is 1 item. Okay, that's the plural form for count 1. But you also could say there are count items. That's the second plural form of English. English is super simple. It has 2 plural forms. French also has 2 plural forms, but it doesn't work the same. Because in English, if you have 0, you say there are 0 items. That's a valid sentence. In French, you don't say there are 0 items. This is the other way around. You use this one for the 0. So there are 2 plural forms that have different rules. And now I just took 2 simple languages. Now, if you take Czech, for instance, they have 3 plural forms. If you take Russian, they have another number of plural forms. If you take Arabic, they might have 20 plural forms, based if it's modulo 10, modulo 100, if it's even or odd, if it's 3 or 4. Every language has different characteristics. There is a website that shows that, if you're interested. Just for the fun of looking at all the things. So these are all the Unicode standard rules for localization. You see Afrikaans, Akan, all the languages, they have different rules. If I take English, here it's kind of simple. Like one day it explains everything. You see, it's very nice. And in the orchard module, what we did is that default the role provider. So there is a service that implements all these rules for the languages and will give you the number, the index of the plural form based on the language and the number. So if I look for English, this is this line. So all these languages here, they have the same rule for plural forms. This is the most common one, apparently. Wow. And the idea is that if the number is 1, if it's not 1, this is the first plural form, while the second, this is 0 based index. Otherwise, it's the first one, which means 0 and more than 1 are the second plural form, and 1 is the first plural form. So this is English, and if I look at French, it will see the same thing. And there are things like this. Look at that. If I take, where is Arabic? Arabic. If 0 or if 2 or if modulo 100, but less than 10, okay, you see all these things? Every language has different characteristics. So this provider that is available by default with the PO file provider, but can be customized, is used automatically there. So the idea is when you have the T and you use the PO file module, you can do something like this. Dot plural, and then pass the string that is used for the first form, and then the string that is used for the second form. And here it's important to have all the strings because, again, if you don't have the strings in your PO file, then it will just use the ones that are inline. So you have nothing to translate by default. It will just work in English because here the default language is English. But if you were using Arabic as your default view language, you would need a plural extension method that will have all the forms available by default. Okay, so we just provide the one with 2 plural forms, but you should extend that to the number of plural forms that you want. There is an overload that takes a string array by instance. So here, this is how you do that. And then in your PO file, I will take French. Yeah, there is one item. So imagine, so it's French, but imagine we don't care about the result. These are so there is one item. So actually this one, I don't know. I don't need to put the format here. And this is the first form, the second form, the third form, and so on. So here I can just remove this one. We don't need that. And this is when I would just keep form 1, form 2, just to see how it works. Okay. So here, and I would run this app. Almost done. And so by default count will be 0. So it says there are 0 items because I didn't provide it. If I say count equals 1, there is 1 item because this is right now it's English that has been selected. So it says 0 is the same as plural. So if I take 5, there are 5 items. Okay, so 5 or 0 are the same form. But if I say 1, it's taking the second, the 1 form. Okay, the number 0. Now, if I go to French, which has my localization, I will do culture equal FR. I get culture equals FR. This is 1 item. I should have add there are, maybe I made a mistake. Oh, there is a dot. Oh, there is a dot in the key. Okay. I could have fixed it both ways, but so here again, if I form 1, and for this thing, we should have form 0. Sorry. No, form 2. Okay, form 1, form 2, sorry. So that's how it works. And the idea is that in some languages, you will have more than 2 forms, and the PO file will be able to have all these things. If I can do copy paste, okay. So that's how it works, and that's very important for good localization to be able to support pluralization.
And it's based on that number that is configured on Orchard by default.
Yes, so the standard rules that we find in this document are implemented by default in the Orchard package. And you can customize it, but you should not have to do it because that's a standard. If one day it changes, then we'll update the package and it will change, but that never changes.
And to be clear, the pluralization support is not in box. That's not that is built on top of the core abstraction in the box, but the resource manager and regex system doesn't really support pluralization. You would have to basically invent a format that can be still live inside the limitations of regex and resource lookup in order for that to happen. And so instead, it's left as an exercise to implementing the provider for the format that does support pluralization. The PO file supports it, and so the provider for PO supports pluralization and adds these extension methods in order to let you look it up. But some folks have pointed out in the chat, like it seems they're questioning the utility of having to pass in every variation up here, but ultimately, as I understand it, these are just being boiled down to message keys. Like the first one is like, this is what I'm going to use as the message ID to look up, or the resource key, or whatever it is, to look it up in the resource provider. And if it doesn't find it, the default fallback behavior is just to show the key. But you don't have to do it this way. You can put an identifier in there if you like. You can make up whatever identifier you want. Like homepage, _ welcome or something. And that could be your, exactly. Which is more traditionally how it's done with regex files in the older style. And then you have to go and provide a string for every language. There's no real concept of a default language that's in the files where you're calling into the localization system. The default language is in its own resource file, and then you set a property for your application that says my default language is X. So there's an extra kind of separation there. So you can still do that if you want to do that. That's absolutely supported.
Yeah, and on the .NET homepage that we were looking before where we shipped today, some of the strings were still in English because we're missing that translation for some of the keys for some of the languages. So as soon as that comes back from the localization team, we'll ship it and it will be live.
You can also start all your strings with is not translated. So if you see that somewhere in your view, that means, I don't have a translation for that thing.
That's not going to work.
Or you can also use a poop emoji. The poop emoji is the best for that. If you see poop on your site, I mean, it's up, not translated. But Dan will show that, I'm sure.
Okay, I want to make sure we give Dan enough time to show what he wanted to show. So should we switch over to your screen, Dan?
Sure, yeah. All right, so I kind of want to just go over one of the tricky things with implementing the localization on our side was having it SEO friendly. I know that's not out of the box. Out of the box, you get like the parameter cultures and whatnot. In our project, we the way we did that was we have a Razor page project. So what we did was we went through the templates and we kind of iterated through each of the routes and added this culture constraint to prepended that to our templates. And this one, and then we validate this culture constraint with the culture constraint route constraint, which we extended. And this way we know we have exactly the cultures that we want. And if the user jumps to a different culture or like an incorrect culture, we can switch it back to the default one, whether it's the cookie culture or like a header culture or whatever's on the browser. So right here, we kind of validate it by iterating through, our supported list and kind of comparing that with whatever the route key is that we have at the moment.
And so this is to prevent diluting the SEO like value of a site if spiders hit it with whatever random cultures in the query. Okay.
Exactly. And then the main logic that handles kind of like the transition between going to the .net.microsoft.com website without a route is a culture routing rules, which we have to kind of, fall back to the default, which is ENUS, or to kind of partially match if the user just puts EN. So right here, we kind of have all that logic. We're trying to, the first thing we do is kind of go through and get the value from the cookie. And then if it's not in the cookie, then we look into the header, the request header. And then after that, we kind of, if that doesn't exist, then we kind of just default back to the original. And that is implemented, added through the middleware that we register right here.
Cool.
Yeah, and some like when we launch, and I think Niels is watching, like he sent a feedback that we had some routing issues like on the day of the launch that we managed to fix. And so that piece was like, I think the part that was more complicated for us, and getting those fixed. And I think like the next improvement that we want to make is like checking how we're setting the locale, and when do we set the cookie and when we just we don't save it. I think like we still have to make some improvements on that logic. And so yeah, we have lots of work to do. But like I was super excited to have that. Like we've been working for a long time on this and strategizing on how we would do it. And also the localization team, like they shipped the PO file support like earlier last year, and so like we were the first team to use their tooling for PO. Like all of the other teams still use resource files, so maybe that's a shift that other internal teams might start using and adopting. I've heard about some performance issues sometimes when the site starts getting too large with resource files, and kind of how you can hit some struggles with that. And so far PO file has been super good for our team. And for the anniversary launch, where we had a very short time frame and lots of PRs going, like the localization handoff was super simple, because I kind of like combine all the resource strings into one PR and send it into our localization branch. And so we did the handoff while all the other work was going. And so we could do things in parallel and speed up the process sort of thing. So it was kind of easy to get that going as well, and trying to sim ship in the languages we support.
Can you show one of the localized Razor files?
Yeah, of course. Let's see. So this is our index file that you're seeing as the main landing page here. And what we have is, like Sebastien said, we have the translator and, oh no. My VS crashed.
Oh, nice.
Sorry about that.
Cool.
Here we go. Cool.
Oh, there you go. Yeah.
So here we, I've added an injection to all the all the Razor pages for the IV localizer. That's why you don't see it here, but everywhere, you can see all the strings being translated. We use t.getString for the view data because that is a string and not a view localizable string.
Oh.
Should we fix that, Sebastien?
You should fix that
Okay.
before it's too late.
We have like
just
yeah.
by experience, I've shipped in the last 3 weeks 2 Orchard Core CMS security fixes due to bad usage of localization strings.
We
Like
should take
one
that
out
offline.
of 1 million, but that's very important. Never try to go against an HTML localized string or HTML content or I just want the string. Sure. No, don't do that. I would say that your way might be more secure actually, but you might have double encoding issues in this case. But
gotcha.
So that's not bad. Just don't do that.
That thing there about just using that @t and then putting the string in, what's interesting about that, so I've been doing small contributions to the .NET site for a while, and well before it was localized. But what's neat is it just automatically falls through. So you can just use that, and then when you're ready to localize the site, then you just supply that, you just kind of turn it on. That does remind me of one other question, which I do think is important, is how this relates to performance. Like, does this localization add, is it cached? Does it slow down the rendering of the site perceptibly?
It's a cost. So like anything where, I mean, you're going from effectively a string literal that's compiled into the assembly, like in a Razor file, when you just type text, like it's HTML, that ultimately is a C# string, literal. So it's as cheap as just rendering printing anything to the screen that you typed into the Visual Studio. Once you add indirection, where it's looking up through a service, which has whatever overhead that service has, it is not cached by default. There's no caching built in the sense that the iView localizer or the iString localizer has caching built in. But as Seb kind of alluded to in the chat before, there's generally a couple of phases in most localization systems where some point the resources have to be loaded from wherever they're stored. And whether it's a database or a file on disk or embedded in assembly, something triggers the loading of that resource. Not the individual string, but the resource itself that the string lives in. And then the resolution of a given string is typically incredibly fast, like done in memory, okay? And so you should expect, in something that's implemented well, you would expect that the individual lookup of a string is very, very fast. But where you could get something that you notice is that initialization, like when does it first get loaded? Is it the first time someone calls it, which means if you're the first person to the site or the first person on a page and you hit a resource that hasn't been loaded yet, is there a wait there? That really depends on the implementation. And so, but I don't know of any tests that sort of try and standardize how, let's compare performance of a site like this before and after it's been localized with a given localization provider. I'm not aware of any tests like that, but the .NET website obviously went through this and they don't have any issues, but I imagine they're quite heavily cached as well, in the sense that they have layers of caching like lots of applications, web applications do, whether it's caching entire fragments of pages, caching entire pages, caching chunks of data from code. There's lots of ways that you can do caching. And so in a Razor file, for example, you can wrap any block in a cache element, which is a cache tag helper, or a distributed cache element, which is a distributed cache tag helper. And then that fragment will be cached according to whatever rules that you pass in to that element, varying by whatever variables that you want to. And if you do that, and inside there are localization lookups, there'll be no cost for those after the first time because they'll be served out of cache. And so like anything where you call through a method, there's the chance that there'll be a performance impact, but whether that's a problem or not really comes down to the scenario and your own testing.
Cool. There were some questions about like, how do you actually, what's your workflow for, like, we're looking at this file and it's got these @t.net 20 years. How do you go from here to, like, compiling all those PO files that you need to send off to get localized. Does that make sense? Like, how do you get that list of all your strings that you need to get localized by file and stuff?
So we initially, in generating the PO file, we use a PO extractor. But after that, after it extracts all the POs, we have to
What is PO extractor?
That's a GitHub tool. It's a tool on GitHub.
That's a tool that one of the Orchard contributor named Lucas Bart made to extract all the T of something in your views or in your source code, like CS files, and generate those PO files.
Oh, cool.
Exactly. Yeah.
Nice.
And that saved us a lot of time. So thank you.
Yeah, and sometimes we'll, like, when it's an easy change, like, we will just edit the resources file with that, like, or we'll regenerate. So that's the part where I said we're still looking into the pipeline improvement. So that one is the generation of the resource PO. How can we automate that portion? And then the other thing is, once we get the artifacts back from Loc, like, how we pull it out, because we had some issues that they just fixed like 1 or 2 weeks ago with, like, some breaking things that were like we were having to, like, manually fix the translated PO files. We were not focusing on automating, but that's the next step.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, one caveat with using the final string as the ID is that if you change the string, then there is no correlation between the previous string and the new one. So if we just change like one typo, you forgot a dot somewhere, it's a new string to translate. It's not, there is no way to say, oh, there is just a new dot, so just fix the translation with the new dot somewhere also in all the translations. That's one of the issues with this workflow.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, even if you just add a comma, it's a new string. Then you should go through the localization process.
Yeah. And then can you write tests against that you can say, like, hey, I'm missing, as part of this automation, I would think you'd want to, like, maybe even have unit tests that just say, hey, these PO things, there was no resource found.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So the strategy I mentioned earlier, which is add some poop in the string by default. So if you see some poop, I'm sorry, I'm using poop because everyone knows poop, but you could use any custom string, like
put some emoji in there.
Yeah.
Well, any emoji.
Or the shrugging unicorn.
Sorry.
Yeah. Couldn't find it.
Like millions, I used one. And then you could have a how do you call that? Like a tool that will download your website, hit
the
all
crawler,
the pages,
for example.
the crawler,
Yeah.
yes, and find for these jars or these beacons. If it's there, it means, oh, there is no translation for that, or we didn't put it into brackets like localization. So yeah, that's a way, I think. Or maybe have a special mode in the localizer provider that says if a string is not found, throw an exception or log a warning. That could be a solution also, actually.
That would be really
PR,
cool.
John? Can you send a PR to our
There you go. I'll work on that
PO
today.
file extractor? So if the string is not found, just log a warning as an option.
I'll make a note. String not found.
As I'm saying that, I'm telling you,
Sebastien.
Hicham Benateya is already implementing it because he must be watching it. He's worked so much on localization modules for Octane, for Orchard, for ASP.NET that yeah. So just mention it.
John, there's a comment here from Martin that you might want to highlight. So this used to be a thing. I haven't seen this at work in a while, but we used to do this in Visual Studio. I'm assuming we still do. But there is a process called pseudo-localization, which is effectively generating random strings. That's at least how we used to do it, as far as I understand. And so you would run your app, your project, wherever it was, through a pseudo-localizer, and then you would be able to see if you can understand any of the text. It means you've got a localization bug. Because effectively every label, everywhere that text is displayed in your app, whether it's something like VS or a website, it should all be gobbledygook. It should all be absolutely random characters because it's been pseudo-localized. And if anything isn't, it means that, you know, if you find your English text or whatever, it's like, oh, okay, we've obviously missed a localization string here. And so I know that there were folks at Microsoft who would regularly run pseudo-localized VS builds as part of the normal iteration of building a new version of VS. And you would often see a bug logged where someone, you know, we forgot to localize a string, and there would be a screenshot of the pseudo-localized build. Because what you're not trying to find a missing culture. You're not trying to find, oh, we missed the Japanese string for this. You're trying to find where we haven't even called in to the localization system in order to look up a specific locations or cultures string. And so you'd see a screenshot of this dialogue in VS, and all the labels are gobbledygook except for one, and the button says okay or something in plain text. Like, oh, well, we forgot to localize that. So yeah, I haven't seen pseudo-localization mentioned in quite a while, actually. So it might just be I'm not close to that part of the system.
There is a null localizer in the Orchard core package.
Oh, okay, a null localizer. Okay, so if
you see something, then you've got an issue.
Okay, there you go.
Yeah, my boss Handsome, like he was talking, and I think John just posted his post. So like when we started this project, like he mentioned the pseudo localizer and his blog post. We haven't had a chance to try that, so we should.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, we're at about a good time to wrap up, I think. Here, this is cool. It's exciting to see as you talked about your plan to roll out more languages. So that's cool. And then Damian, Sebastien, you mentioned, like, you know, people have input on what they would like to see in localization. What's the best way for them to do that? Just file an issue, or
keep it for yourself.
Send a PR.
Too much work.
So there's a couple layers, you know, as we said before. There's the abstractions like iString localizer and the core localization system. That's in .NET/runtime, that GitHub repo. So if you want to log issues in there. ASP.NET Core has a layer that sits on top of that, the middleware, the view localizer, the features in MVC, the data annotations localizer, which we didn't even talk about. That's in MVC in ASP.NET Core, so you could log issues in the ASP.NET Core repo. And then Orchard Core has the PO file localizer, the pluralization service, and there's a bunch of other tools and things. And so you could log stuff there. But if you think there's stuff missing from .NET itself, or perhaps you're using Blazor and want to see some other stuff that it's not doing, or perhaps a newer platform like Maui, then yeah, go ahead and log issues or send feedback through the normal channels to the folks that you know.
Cool. All right. Well, I think this is a great place to wrap up. This is exciting to see. It's been years in the making, kind of seeing this localization support added to both .NET and then seeing it run on a site with millions of monthly users. So this is really, really cool. So, all right. Well, thanks everyone for showing up, and thanks folks.